So The Idea of Fashion is the title of my book. It's based on the research I conducted during my PhD. I'm a fashion historian, and I'm interested in the historiography of fashion, meaning how fashion has been written, how the history of fashion has been written. And my research aims to uncover new ways of critically thinking about fashion throughout history. Historically speaking, fashion has often been described and analyzed throughout the years, the century, through objects, through images. And I was interested in understanding not so much what fashion looked like, not so much how fashion materialized in objects, but who wrote about fashion, who talked about fashion, and through these various discourses, what definitions of fashion we can see evolving, changing throughout history. So the history of fashion has a rather long tradition. It's maybe not as rich as the history of art, for instance. If you're studying painting or sculpture, you obviously have a much richer tradition to deal with. The first fashion historians, we generally say, have started producing work in the West in somehow around the middle of the 19th century. So it's a rather recent history when we think about it. And of course, we've inherited lots of great books, lots of great thinkers, but there is still a lot to understand. There's still a lot to rethink today. So my purpose was really to say, okay, we've established about 150 years of a tradition of writing the history of fashion. What are the new perspectives we can adopt now? How can we rethink the history of fashion? How can we maybe identify different chapters? How can we identify different players as well? So it was critical rethinking of the tradition of fashion history. So my research was all about demonstrating that fashion today for us, for the students that I teach at IFM, I think it's quite obvious that fashion is about consumption. It's something that we connect with commodities, with whether it's a jean, t-shirt, a jacket. It's something that's very tangible. And it's also something, of course, that is there to help us affirm and forge an identity. My interest was to demonstrate how this understanding of fashion that we have today is rather new. If we go back in time and if we look at the late 18th century, early 19th century, the word fashion, the idea of fashion, is something that is not very embodied. It's more of an attitude. It's more of a behavior, a way of, yes, existing in society. And I've tried to demonstrate how through the rise of consumer culture, through the development of the Industrial Revolution, we've eventually come to understand that fashion were objects, that fashion were things that we could purchase. And eventually, the last part of my research focuses on how this object of fashion has eventually gained an artistic recognition. This is also something that's quite new. For us, especially in a fashion school like IFM, it's very clear that there's a creative process behind each fashion silhouette. Well, this is something that was not so evident before, and it's something that was fought hard by the early fashion designers who needed to demonstrate to their peers that they were not just suppliers, people that were given orders to, but that in fact they had a creative idea, a vision of something that they wanted to do, just like a painter, just like a musician, and that their artwork was a collection. So my work is really about understanding these shifts in our understanding of fashion from an attitude to an object, a technical object and commodity, and later on, late 19th century, and of course throughout the 20th century, how fashion has become understood in the West, and specifically in Paris, we have to say, as a form, as a creative practice. Here at IFM, I'm fortunate to be teaching fashion history and theory to most programs here. So for the master students in design and management, but also the students in bachelor. And so I teach fashion history. And one can expect that indeed fashion history is about following the evolutions of the shapes of garments. Why is it that at the turn of the century, women all would have to wear corsets, had very wide sleeves, very long skirts, and why 50 years later, 60 years later, women could wear mini skirts. So on one level, you can look at the history of fashion and you can teach fashion history as a succession of shifting silhouettes. What I try to share with the students is how you can have an understanding of fashion that goes beyond images, beyond objects. And it's not to mean that we're ignoring them, but if you understand what the idea of fashion is, how fashion is an expression of values, political values, social values, sometimes religious values as well. So if you take fashion more seriously, if I may say, if you look at it as an intellectual project, you're able to grasp a much more diverse and wide understanding of what fashion is. And I think today it's something that really speaks to us, the way that fashion can express diversity, the way that fashion can express a very wide and diverse set of identities. And I think this is where I hope we connect, and I hope that I can trigger both their critical thinking and perhaps their creativity as well. What I enjoy about fashion history is that it's a field that's very much alive, and this is what I try and share with the students. Arguably, when you are a young person at the beginning of the 21st century, you can think of the 19th century as a very old, faraway land, something, let's say, a bit boring. It's something that seems obviously very old-fashioned. And for me, it's a very important moment because it's where the idea of democracy, it's where the idea of expressing oneself within also a new system that would develop an industrial capitalist system. It's really when fashion as an industry thrived. And sharing with students the beginning of all of this, the good parts, fashion as a creative process, fashion as a creative practice, and the more critical understanding, the idea of labor, the idea of production, a lot of what we're dealing with today, a lot of the issues that fashion is still very much connected with today, were born in the 19th century. So what I love about teaching fashion history is to be able to share with students the importance of history and the fact that understanding history is never about dealing with only old discourses and old images. There's always new ways of looking at this. A very good example, today we're much more advanced, or at least the field of gender studies, for instance, is thriving. Well, today with these tools, with these methodologies, with these theories that have been forged over the past few decades, we can reconsider the 19th century and we can relook at how women existed socially, how they had to create their existence, their identity, and their gender identity. So this is what I found very fascinating, is that history and theory are very much alive and thriving. It's what we do when we discuss with other researchers, when we do conferences, and it's really what I try and share with the students to show that it's not, just about looking back. It's very much about looking at the past, but also looking forward. Understand the future of fashion. You cannot build the future of fashion if you don't have a clear understanding of its history. So history is fundamental to everyone. Creative directors, managers, CEOs, everyone has to have an interest in history.